Okay guys, coming at you for the third and last part of this video lecture on progressivism and the rise of Roosevelt. And Roosevelt already rose. There's the official presidential portrait, but what I want to talk about now is what happens after Roosevelt's presidency. Uh, you know what, hang on a second. Let me get a little water. And I'm wearing one of the world's greatest shirts, by the way. 1963 Penley vintage. Look at this. Can you dig it? Okay. All right. I'm not going to cover Roosevelt's presidency. Your book does that well enough for me. But what I do want to talk about are a few things that happened after his presidency, if for no other reason so that I can tell you maybe the greatest presidential anecdote ever. Okay? So, 2 months after leaving office in 1909, Roosevelt goes off with his son Kermit to Africa on a safari sponsored by the Smithsonian as a way of acquiring specimens for the museum. Roosevelt brings 4,000 pounds of salt with him because he knows he's going to kill a lot of animals. He's going to have to pack the hides and salt to send them back to the Smithsonian halfway around the world, right? In 6 months in Africa, Roosevelt and his party trap or shoot over 11,000 animals. Okay? Dude loved to hunt. Over 11,000 animals. And of course, the size and the power of the Rooseveltian personality ends up leading to toys or created Teddy's Adventures in Africa. You know, if you look over here at your left, you can see a little Teddy, like, action figure with his gun, and back behind him on the far left, a guy with the box camera and, you know, animals and whatever. Classic, right? I would love to see the actual toys, but I have this for you. So anyway, he's off in Africa. He's having a gas. He's living it up. And he gets newspapers from New York every 3 weeks. A batch of papers arrive to kind of keep him abreast of what's going on, okay? And Roosevelt becomes uneasy with the way that Taft is handling the presidency. Not only was Taft constantly at odds with the insurgents, the reform-minded wing of the Republican Party, but he seemed to be making things too easy on big business to suit Roosevelt. So Roosevelt cuts his trip short by 6 months. He returns home. He sends, telegram way ahead of that he's returning at such and such a date. He's met down at the harbor by like 10,000 cheering Rooseveltians. I mean, the guy is like Superman. He runs home to kiss his wife and pat all the kids on the head or whatever, spends a little time with the wife and kids one night, and then he gets on a train, woo woo, and he's off to Washington, D.C. because he wants to go and talk to Taft and see if things can be sorted out. Okay, now ask yourself this question, guys. What do we call our former presidents? Think about it for a minute. What do you call a former president? What's their title of address? It's kind of a trick question. It's simple. You call them Mr. Clinton or Mr. Bush or Mr. Carter, or soon it's going to be Mr. Obama, right? You just call them Mr. whatever, fill in your name here. When Roosevelt is ushered into the Oval Office to see his old friend William Howard Taft, as he came forward, Taft stood up and said in a very nice way, "Mr. President, so good to see you looking so well. Africa has agreed with you, it seems." Now, just about anybody, I would suggest to you, greeted in such a polite manner by the sitting president of the United States would have said something back like, "Oh no, Mr. President, I'm just so-and-so now, regular American citizen." But not our boy Teddy. No, he just grabbed Taft's hand and pumped the hell out of it and said, "Good to see you as well, Howard. How have you been?" Everybody in the room kind of looked somewhere else for a minute. Well, it's kind of embarrassing, like a real faux pas. But Roosevelt paid no attention. He just did what he always did throughout the course of his life, which was charge forward and get to the point. Now let's take a step back for a minute. Roosevelt had campaigned for Taft in 1908 to help him win the presidency for the Republican Party. And he had essentially selected Taft to be the Republican nominee as an incredibly popular and powerful president. He'd really pushed Taft, and Taft got the nomination. In Taft, he saw the man who would protect and continue and expand the square deal. But as I said earlier, Taft had proven to be, in Roosevelt's eyes, a little too business-friendly and not reform-friendly enough, not progressive enough. And from Roosevelt's point of view, the square deal seemed to be in danger. So Roosevelt felt personally betrayed, and he began to question Taft very aggressively at this lunch, at the White House luncheon, right? And implying in no uncertain terms that Taft was an ingrate and that Roosevelt had given him this job, and why wasn't he doing what he should do? And Taft is saying, well, hold on now, Theodore, just wait a minute. I won the election. And Roosevelt saying, you won the election. I won it for you. And so they go back and forth, and they break in wrath and acrimony. Roosevelt storms out. Taft is left steaming and angry. The friendship is broken. Okay, this is in the spring of 1910. The next presidential election is 2 years away, more than 2 years away. So what does Theodore Roosevelt do? He uses his immense celebrity to get invited to make speeches. He talks to the newsmen at every possible opportunity. He never wastes a moment where he can criticize Taft and wonder out loud about the future well-being of the United States and the American people. And by the time the 1912 rolls around, which is the election year, it's clear that the Republican Party at that point is uneasily split between the more traditional conservative men who preferred Taft and the more progressive, reform-minded Republicans who favored another term for Roosevelt. But this raises, pardon me, an interesting question. Could Teddy run again? And if he could, should he run again? It was not until 1951 that the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution was passed, which strictly limited any president to 2 terms, period. In Roosevelt's day, however, there was a tradition that had begun with gorgeous George Washington, guys, back in the day. First president, right? Washington said no man should seek more than 2 terms as president. To seek more than 2 terms would indicate that you were power hungry and maybe a dictator in the making. You didn't know how to just let go of power and walk away, which is what George did. So ever since Washington's time, no president had ever sought a 3rd term. 2 terms were good enough for George. They were good enough for everybody else. But Roosevelt's case was strange because he'd only been elected to 1 term, which was his 2nd term. He inherited the 1st term from McKinley after the assassination. And Roosevelt had only served about 3.5 of that term's years. So there was certainly an argument that could be made that Roosevelt, having only sought election once, could certainly seek election again, especially because he took 4 years off, right? So clearly he's not power hungry. Clearly he knows how to let go of power, right? Well, okay. But Roosevelt is very conscious of how the history books are going to portray him, and he didn't want to be seen, pardon me, in a negative light. But he did legitimately feel that the country was in danger and that Taft could not be allowed to serve 4 more years. And the presumptive Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, in Roosevelt's own words, the man has all the backbone of a banana. He has the spirit of an eclair. Weak. He's not the kind of guy that America needs. Roosevelt knows what America needs. More Teddy, right? So what he does is he begins to talk to people to let people know in a sort of roundabout way that while he could not in any sort of good conscience seek the Republican nomination, he would certainly be able to heed the will of the people if at the Republican National Convention they should happen to call his name. He'd be ready. Okay, so here comes the Republican National Convention. In the summer of 1912, a movement begins to secure the nomination for Roosevelt. It gains strength. The delegates do battle between Taft, Roosevelt. Ultimately, they cast their votes, and Taft gets the nomination to seek re-election. Because he was the sitting president and wielded a lot of power within the party, and also because ultimately Roosevelt was simply too liberal/progressive for the majority of Republicans. Just that simple. Now, I'm sure that you can imagine that Teddy was crushed not to have gotten the nod from his lifelong party, the party of his father, the party of Lincoln, the party that he loved so much. But I'm also sure, or maybe you've heard, the old saying that politics makes strange bedfellows, unquote. Meaning, when people are trying to get things done politically, they'll get into bed with somebody who yesterday was their worst enemy. People will cooperate and ally for political purposes when normally they wouldn't even speak to each other. So the thing is, Roosevelt wants to be president, and he needs a party to get there. So the Progressive Party, they come to Roosevelt and they say, we would love you to run for us. We would love you to be our nominee for the presidency in this election. Roosevelt was never crazy about the progressives. He felt that they were irresponsible in a lot of ways. Your book has talked about this. Even though he and they often had the same agenda and the same goals in mind, he didn't always like the way they went about things, but the bottom line is he needs a party, and politics make strange bedfellows. So Roosevelt says, by God, I'll do it. And he accepts. They have a national convention. Teddy makes a big speech, 10 hours long or some ridiculous thing. He loved to make big, long speeches. And off he goes, charging across the country with all of his customary energy, making speech after speech and stop after stop and campaigning his head off for the presidency. At one of these early stops, he's talking to the reporters afterwards. They ask him how he's feeling. Is he tired? He makes a muscle man pose like this and says, why, I'm fit as a bull moose. They like that. He says it again at the next day when he gets the opportunity, and again. And within about 3 days, he said it so many times, and it's become so popular that the leaders of the Progressive Party realize that there's no choice, that they've got to change their name to the Bull Moose Party. The power of the Rooseveltian personality is just, it's so overwhelming that they just say, yeah, we're the Bull Moose Party, man, right? So they become the Bull Moose Party, and as you can see here, Roosevelt milked that identity for all that he was worth. He started campaigning with this stuffed moose head. He rode a moose across the river. No, this is a very cleverly doctored photograph. Yeah, I mean, this is before Photoshop. Guys, look at this. It's really pretty spectacular, right? This never really happened. But Roosevelt did capitalize on this, bull moose story to the absolute best of his abilities, okay? And now we come to the anecdote that I wanted to tell you, and I think is, if not the greatest presidential anecdote ever, it's certainly one of them. And that is, pardon me for the agua there, that at one of his campaign stops, a fellow by the name of John Schrank shot Roosevelt at point-blank range, about 3-4 feet away, before he went up on stage to speak. Shot him in the chest, was captured. Why did he shoot Roosevelt? Because he was irritated that he ran for another term. Literally, that's all he ever said. Clearly, the guy was touched in the head. He's going to spend the rest of his life in an institution with the criminally insane. But what happens after Roosevelt gets shot? What happens? He goes up and makes a 90-minute speech with the bullet in him. Okay, that's what happens. Here you see, okay, let me put it a different way. Roosevelt made long speeches. He folded his speeches into this kind of like rectangle of thick paper, and he put them in an eyeglasses case, and he carried it in the inner pocket of his coat. The bullet went through the paper, through the case, and lodged under his pectoral muscle against his sternum. Okay, this is the shirt, right? Teddy went up and spoke anyway, 90 minutes before he went to the doctor. This is a little bit of what he said. Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully comprehend it, but I've just been shot. Sorry, but I've just been shot. And then he goes like this, however, it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. The bullet is in me even now. At this point, some guy in the audience yelled, fake or phony or something like that. So Roosevelt unbuttons everything and shows them the bloody shirt, shows them the wound. Okay. And then he says, I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best. He's going to speak for 90 minutes. Okay. He says, I have altogether too many important things to feel any concern over my own death, and I want you to understand that I'm ahead of the game anyway. I've been able to do certain things that I very much wish to do in life, and I'm interested in doing other things. I can tell you with absolute truthfulness that I'm very much interested in uninterested in whether I am shot or not. Because the abuse that has been heaped upon me lately in this political campaign should make any man take pause. At this point, one of his handlers off to the side is going, you have to come to the hospital. Come here, right? Roosevelt says, no, no, sir, no. I will not stop. You cannot stop, and no man can make me stop. My friends are a little concerned about me, but don't you waste any sympathy on me. I've had an A1 time in my life, and I'm having an A1 time now. So let me get to my formal speech. And then, like I said, an hour and a half later, he goes to the hospital. They felt that it was too dangerous to try to remove the bullet. He lived with it in his chest for the next 7 years. Couldn't exercise as much and got a little heavy as a result of it. But at any rate, so what happens? Well, what happens is that he loses the election. I mean, let's think about it, guys. You've basically got two parties in the country for all intents and purposes, and each party, for all intents and purposes, has about half the voters voting, right? Republican, Democrat. When you take one of those parties and you break it in half, clearly the guy in the other party that didn't break in half is going to win, right? So you can see here that Woodrow Wilson got an overwhelming number of the electoral votes. However, when you look at the popular vote and you tally it up and you say to yourself, gosh, if Taft hadn't gotten the nomination and Roosevelt had, how many votes might Roosevelt have gotten? Well, maybe 7.5 million? Maybe only 7 million. He would have still beat Wilson, which is a testimonial, really, to how enormously popular Roosevelt was, right? Even 4 years after he had actually left the presidency. Now, what happens next? Just a minute or two here, guys, and we're going to be done. Very soon after this, World War I is going to start in 1914. Woodrow Wilson did his best to keep us out of that war for several years. Roosevelt criticized him day and night. He felt that the war would be a good thing for the United States for a variety of reasons. He campaigned, he crusaded, he argued in favor of our entry into the war. And then when we did enter the war, Roosevelt's youngest son, his favorite son, Quentin, who was a pilot, he volunteered, he went over, and he died. His plane was shot down on the Western Front, and he lost his life. About 6 months after that, Roosevelt died of a broken heart. That's what everybody said. That's the line you get over and over, that Theodore Roosevelt died of a broken heart because of the loss of his beloved son, Quentin. Well, he had an aneurysm. We know for a fact that he died because of an aneurysm that went to his heart. And, well, I don't know. If an aneurysm goes to your heart, what does it do? Break it? So maybe he did die of a broken heart. Upon receiving the word of his death, his son Archibald telegraphed his brothers and sisters with one line: "The old lion is dead." Woodrow Wilson's vice president, Thomas R. Marshall, said that death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, because if he'd been awake, there would have been a fight. Take a moment and read this, guys, and this will give you a sense of the enormity of Roosevelt's energy and the things that he accomplished in his life. It's sort of unbelievable when you look at this. After you've read this, pause and ask yourself, am I really busy? You know, people always say, I don't have any time. There's no way I can get anything else done. I can't possibly, whatever. I mean, this, guys, right here, this is a busy life. Roosevelt once said, "I have enjoyed as much of life as any 10 men that I know." And a reporter for Life magazine who spent several weeks with him to do an article on him when he was president said that he laughed over 100 times a day, and that it was like being in the company of a schoolboy who was on summer vacation. Ida Tarbell, one of the muckrakers that Roosevelt was not crazy about, said there was something imminent about him, like an avalanche that the sound of your voice might loosen. I felt that his clothing might not contain him. At every moment he was so steamed up, ready to go, to attack anything, anywhere. And when he died, she wrote of him, "Theodore Roosevelt and the Niagara Falls, both great wonders of nature." Other people use these words. You find it over and over and over in letters, newspaper articles. People use words like this to describe Roosevelt. Radioactive, a steam engine in trousers, a solar conflagration, electricity, high voltage wires, generators, and dynamos. And Woodrow Wilson, who had no reason to love Roosevelt, said of him, he had unquestionably the greatest gift of personal magnetism ever possessed by an American. In the World Cup in 2014, you had this character down there in Brazil at every game, and once the news guys got a hold of him, they showed him all the time. Here he is dressed up like Roosevelt in his Rough Riders outfit, right? You know, there's not that many presidents that you could dress up like and sort of be instantly recognized, like, hey, that's, you know, I mean, I guess you could put a white wig on and wear a black suit and look like your teeth hurt and be George Washington, or clearly you could do Lincoln, but he wants to wear a black suit all day and a big stovepipe hat and a fake beard. I mean, Roosevelt just has this kind of larger-than-life personality that people recognize. And I really feel that I would be remiss in my duties here, not just as an instructor of history, but as a film buff, if I did not recommend to you from the very bottom of my heart that you rent. You can get it on Netflix, all over the place. It's easily acquired. You've got to see this film, The Wind and the Lion. Sean Connery is the star. Forget James Bond. Sean Connery, the original James Bond, the greatest James Bond. I get it, but this is his greatest role as El Razuli, the Magnificent. Brian Keith plays Theodore Roosevelt. It's not about Roosevelt, it's about El Razuli. But Brian Keith has 5 or 6 scenes in it. And in it, even though he probably only has about 15 minutes of total screen time, Brian Keith gives one of the 3 or 4 all-time great performances as an American president. It's an absolutely tremendous performance. It really gives you the sense of what Roosevelt was like. Look, guys, let me just put it to you this way. If you rent the movie and it costs you money, and you write me back like a half page, 10 lines, and tell me why you thought it sucked, I'll pay you back. I'll send you the money on PayPal. Okay? Seriously, it's that great, and I really, really urge you to see it. Okay? Last but not least, one of Theodore Roosevelt's great lines. As much has been given us, much will be expected of us. I happen to know that Stan Lee, the father of most of Marvel Comics' great superhero characters, is a big admirer of Theodore Roosevelt, and it's occurred to me that maybe, just maybe, that line of Roosevelt's is where Stan Lee got Spider-Man's credo. With great power comes great responsibility. Maybe, just maybe. All right, guys, see you soon.